The wind in the Wyoming territory had a way of stripping things down to their essence. It scoured the high plains, peeling the paint from lonely homesteads and whipping the dust from the parched roads into a fine, choking powder that settled on everything like a shroud. In the late autumn of 1889, that wind felt personal, a constant thief of warmth and hope. It moaned through the sparse branches of the cottonwoods lining the ghost of a river, and it made the blades of the Ashford Range's windmill spin with a rhythmic, metallic shriek that sounded like something dying. Etta Mayfield felt the grit between her teeth. She had been walking toward that mournful sound for the better part of an hour, her worn boots sinking into the pale dust. The black dress she wore, the only one she owned, was grayed with it. She kept her head down, a habit formed from grief and the desire to be invisible. Looking up only offered a view of an endless, indifferent sky and the sharp, unforgiving lines of the distant mountains. An old ranch hand she had passed miles back, his face a roadmap of hard seasons, had told her, "The Wyoming wind blows the thoughts right out of a person's head, leaving only what they dare to do." Etta had nothing left but the dare. The need was a physical ache, sharper than the wind's bite. She had to find a place, any place, to earn the final sum to pay for her husband's burial. A quiet debt for a quiet man. Gone now to the railroad fever that had claimed so many. The Ashford Range appeared slowly, a collection of low, weathered buildings huddled together as if for protection. The main house was sturdy, but the land around it told a story of hardship. The cattle in the nearest pasture were thin, their ribs showing like ripples on a pond, their hides dusty. A sheet of tin on the barn roof had come loose and rattled a frantic, tinny rhythm against the steady groan of the windmill. This was a place fighting to hold on, and Etta understood that language better than any other. A man stood near the corral, his back to her. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, and even from a distance, he radiated an air of unyielding stillness. Like a boulder, the wind could not move. He was staring at the cattle, but his posture spoke of a gaze turned inward, wrestling with problems that had no easy answers. This had to be Cole Ashford. Etta took a deep breath, the dry air stinging her lungs, and walked toward the barn. Not the house. The house was for family. The barn was for work. She knew her place. As she drew closer, another man emerged from the stables. He was thick-set with a swaggering walk, his face shadowed by the brim of a stained hat. He saw her and his mouth twisted into a smirk. This would be the foreman, the kind of man who measured his worth by the discomfort of others. He watched her approach Cole Ashford, clearly anticipating a dismissal he could enjoy. Cole heard her footsteps and turned. His face was weathered, carved by sun and worry, but his eyes were a startlingly clear gray. They held no warmth, only a deep, weary assessment. He looked at her worn dress, the respectable but threadbare wool, her hands clasped in front of her, and the exhaustion she could not hide. "Looking for work," Etta said. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the tremor in her stomach. It was a statement, not a plea. Cole's gaze swept over the struggling ranch, the lean cattle, the rattling roof. "We are not hiring." The words were flat, final. "I can sweep a stable," she offered, her eyes fixed on his. "Men tack. I can cook, clean, wash, anything that needs doing. I am a hard worker and I do not require much." She saw the flicker of refusal in his eyes and pressed on before he could speak it. "I do not need a bed in the house. The loft in the barn is fine." She had offered him distance, a way to take her on without letting her in. It was the only currency she had. She saw him hesitate. His gaze shifted for a moment toward the main house, where the windows were dark and silent. A tension pulled at the corners of his mouth. He was a man drowning in responsibilities, and she was one more complication, but she was also a pair of hands. The foreman, Pike Laramie, sauntered over. "Boss, you ain't thinking of—" He let his gaze slide over Etta with open disdain. "We got enough mouths to feed." Cole ignored him, his attention still on Etta. He was a man who knew the weight of every dollar, every sack of flour, every hour of labor. He was also, Etta sensed, a man walled off behind a fortress of his own making. Inside that house were his children, the twin anchors of his life, Rosie and Rhett. The whole territory knew of his loss, how his wife had died bringing them into the world, leaving him with 2 small heartbeats to protect in this vast, dangerous land. It had made him hard. People said, but Etta, who had assisted in births among the Shoshone women and knew the fragility of life, suspected it had not made him hard so much as brittle. He looked from her to the barn, a silent calculation running behind his eyes. He needed to keep his herd alive, to protect his claim to the water that was dwindling with every rainless day. A situation his neighbor and the town's banker, Silas Crow, was watching with predatory interest. He needed to keep his children safe and fed. Those were the pillars of his world. Everything else was an expendable luxury. "You can read and write?" he asked abruptly. The question surprised her. "Yes, my father was a school teacher for a time." His expression did not change. Perhaps he saw a use for it, or perhaps it was just another fact to be filed away. The wind gusted, sending a spiral of dust between them. It carried the scent of dry earth, of horse, and of the coming cold. A length of rope hung coiled on a peg by the barn door, its loops perfect and orderly, a small piece of control in a world of chaos. Etta found her eyes drawn to it. It spoke of bindings, of duties, of the ties that hold a life together or pull it apart. "There is a small room off the tack room," Cole said finally, his voice low and rough. "It has a cot. You will take your meals in the cookhouse with the men, after they are done." Relief washed over Etta so powerfully her knees felt weak, but she gave no sign. She simply nodded. "Pike will show you. The work is from before sunup to after sundown." He paused, and his gray eyes locked onto hers, driving home the final, most important term of their agreement. It was a line drawn in the dust, a wall erected between his world and hers, barn only. He turned then and walked back toward the corral, his shoulders set, leaving her in the company of the foreman. Pike Laramie spat a stream of tobacco juice near her boots. "Well now," he drawled, his voice laced with insinuation. "Looks like you got what you wanted. Do not get any ideas. Widow, the boss keeps to his rules." "I am here to work, Mr. Laramie," Etta replied, her tone even. "Nothing more." He led her into the cavernous cool of the barn. The air was thick with the smell of hay and leather and warm animals. High above, the loft was stacked with bales, shadows clinging to the rafters like sleeping birds. He gestured to a narrow door. The room behind it was little more than a closet, containing a simple rope cot, a wash basin, and a single nail on the wall for her belongings. It was more than she had yesterday. It was a harbor. As she stepped inside, she heard a sound from the main house, carried on the wind the faint, sharp cry of a child. It was a sound that pierced the careful armor around her own heart, a ghost of a memory she fought to keep buried. She saw Cole Ashford, who had stopped by the corral fence, look toward the house. His entire body went rigid. The sound came again, thin and fretful. Pike chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "The little ones are a handful, crying all the time since their mother passed. Drives the boss near mad. Cannot find a nursemaid willing to stick it out this far from town." Etta said nothing. She ran a hand over the rough blanket on the cot. Her new life would be lived within these wooden walls. She would be a ghost, a silent worker who earned her keep and kept to the shadows. She would remain unseen, unheard, and uninvolved. That was her goal. To be a person of no consequence, to pay her debt, and to not feel the sharp edges of the world so keenly. That night, as she lay on the narrow cot, the wind howled its lonely song, and the tin roof rattled its desperate percussion. Through the thin walls, she could hear the life of the ranch, the soft stamp and nicker of horses, the low voices of the ranch hands heading to the bunkhouse, the ever-present creak of the windmill. And later, Long after the other sounds had faded, she could still hear it, faint but persistent. The sound that had followed her into her sleep, the inconsolable crying of a child. It was a sound that promised that here, on the edge of the world, no wall was thick enough to keep life out. Family could be chosen, she thought, not just born into, and justice, in a place like this, was not a gift from the law, but something you had to build, day by day, with your own 2 hands. A lantern, left burning on a post outside, cast a single, steady rectangle of light onto her floor, a small, defiant promise against the overwhelming dark. The cold deepened with the darkness, seeping through the cracks in the barn walls. It was a biting, relentless cold that promised a hard frost by morning. Etta lay on her cot, wrapped in the single rough blanket, listening to the wind's ceaseless assault. It was a lonely sound, but tonight it had a counterpoint, faint at first, then rising with the gusts. Came the sound of the twins crying. It was not the brief, hungry cry of an infant easily soothed. This was a duet of raw, sustained misery that scraped at the edges of Etta's resolve. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the sound was inside her head, a phantom echo of a loss she carried every day. She thought of Cole Ashford, alone in that house, trying to comfort 2 small, grieving souls. The crying went on, a desperate, jagged rhythm that seemed to have no end. One voice would trail off into a hoarse gasp, only for the other to pick up the sorrowful tune. Etta sat up. The rule was clear, barn only. It was more than a rule. It was a boundary line between her past and this fragile present. To cross it was to invite complication, to become noticed, to risk the small, anonymous safety she had found. She had promised herself she would not interfere. She would sweep the floors, clean the tack, and remain a shadow. But the crying was relentless. It spoke of a deep, primal distress that no man, however strong-willed, could be expected to soothe alone. It was the sound of motherless children in the dark. She stood, her bare feet cold on the wooden floor. She told herself it was none of her business. She told herself she was only an employee. She told herself she was being foolish. But her feet carried her to the door. The wind hit her with a physical force, stealing her breath and whipping her thin nightdress against her legs. The main house was a dark shape against a sky full of cold, distant stars. A single lamp burned in a downstairs window, a square of lonely yellow light. The crying was louder out here, sharp and clear, with a final, resigned breath. She pulled her shawl tighter and walked across the dusty ground that separated her world from his. The back door was unlatched. She slipped inside, into a kitchen that was clean but felt empty. The air was still and cold. The crying led her up a narrow staircase to a hallway where a door stood ajar. Inside, Cole stood with his back to her, a silhouette against the lantern light on the floor. He was bent over a single large crib that held both children, his large hands hovering uselessly above them as they thrashed and wailed. He spoke to them in a low, rumbling voice, a sound full of a desperate, clumsy tenderness. "Hush now, Rosie, Rhett, that is enough." But his words were swallowed by their grief. He looked utterly defeated, a giant of a man made small by a sorrow he could not fix. He did not hear her enter. Etta moved quietly to the crib. The little girl, Rosie, had a face red and blotchy from tears. The boy, Rhett, was arching his back, his small fists clenched. Etta reached in, her movements calm and certain. She gathered Rosie into one arm and Rhett into the other. They were small, but solid, their little bodies trembling with sobs. Cole finally turned, startled, his face a mask of exhaustion and surprise. His mouth opened to speak, to order her out, but no words came. Etta did not look at him. Her focus was entirely on the children. "They are cold," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "and the wind frightens them." Without waiting for permission, she carried them out of the room, down the stairs, and back across the yard to the barn. The wind was a wild thing now, but she sheltered the twins with her own body, murmuring to them, a continuous, soft sound. Inside the barn, the air was warmer, protected, filled with the comforting, earthy smell of hay and animals. She climbed the ladder to the loft, her burden awkward but precious. There, she settled into a mound of clean, sweet-smelling straw, arranging the twins in the crook of her arms. She began to hum a simple, nameless tune from a childhood she barely remembered. It was a melody of the soil, of quiet evenings and the gentle lowing of cattle. Slowly, miraculously, the crying subsided. Rosie's sobs turned to whimpers, and then to soft, sighing breaths. She nuzzled her face against Etta's shoulder. Rhett's rigid body relaxed, and his frantic gasps evened out. Etta began to sing, her voice soft and unadorned. The words of a simple country lullaby about a river flowing home to the sea. The twins, warm and secure for the first time in hours, drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep. Cole stood in the house for a long time, listening to the silence. It was a profound, unnerving quiet that felt louder than the crying had been. He did not understand what had just happened. The woman he had hired to muck out stalls had walked into his home and, without a word of permission, had taken his children, and she had quieted them. He felt a surge of resentment, a violation of his authority and his privacy. But underneath it was a wave of something else, something he had not felt in a very long time: relief. Driven by a need to see, to understand, he lit a storm lantern, the flame casting dancing shadows on the kitchen walls. He walked out into the night, the lantern swinging in his hand, its light a small, brave circle in the vast darkness. He entered the barn, his boots silent on the straw-scattered floor. He looked up toward the loft. He raised the lantern. The golden light pushed back the shadows, illuminating the scene above. Etta was leaning against a pile of hay, her head bent, her expression one of gentle, weary peace, and nestled in her arms, sleeping soundly against her chest, were his children. Their faces, so often creased with fretful expressions, were smooth and calm. They were dozing in her arms as if they had been born to be there. The sight struck him with the force of a physical blow. He stood frozen, the lantern held high, his knuckles white. The words escaped his lips before he was even aware of forming them. A low, stunned whisper carried on the dust motes in the air. She was taken on only to sweep the stable. His mind was a battlefield. The rule had been broken. The wall he had so carefully constructed around his life, around his heart, had been breached. This woman had overstepped, had presumed a place that was not hers, and yet the proof of his own failure was sleeping peacefully in her arms. The truth was a hard, bitter thing. His children had found comfort with a stranger that he, their own father, could not provide. As he watched, a shadow fell across the barn doorway. It was Pike Laramie, drawn by the light. The foreman's eyes followed Cole's gaze up to the loft. A slow, knowing smirk spread across his face. He saw not a moment of quiet grace, but an act of cunning. He saw a destitute widow using innocent children to secure her position, to work her way from the barn into the house. He nodded once, a gesture of cynical confirmation, and melted back into the darkness, the seed of a poisonous rumor already taking root in his mind. Up in the loft, Rhett stirred. A small, wheezing sound came from his chest, a dry, constricted gasp for air. Etta came instantly alert. Cole tensed, ready to move, but she was already handling it, with an experienced, unhurried motion. She gently shifted the boy, propping his head and shoulders slightly higher against her arm. She unbuttoned the top of his little nightshirt, exposing his chest to the cool air, and then placed the heel of her palm over his sternum. She began to rub, a firm but gentle circular pressure, warming his skin, easing the tightness in his tiny lungs. It was a simple, practiced gesture, a piece of folk wisdom learned in a place where doctors were a day's ride away. After a moment, Rhett's breathing eased, the frightening rasp smoothed out, and he settled back into a deep, untroubled sleep. Cole lowered the lantern, his arm suddenly heavy. What he had just witnessed was not sentiment, it was competence. This woman was not just soft, she was capable. She possessed a quiet knowledge that he desperately lacked, the masculine pride that had been his shield for 2 long years. The stubborn belief that he could and should handle everything on his own began to crack. He had tried to be father and mother, rancher and protector. He had shut his doors and his heart, believing that solitude was strength. He was beginning to see it was just another word for a cage. He was so busy keeping the world out. He had not realized he had locked his children in with his own grief. He made a decision. It was not a surrender, but a strategic retreat. He climbed the ladder to the loft. Etta looked up, her eyes wide in the lantern light, expecting anger, a harsh dismissal. She clutched the children a little tighter. Cole stopped a few feet away, his large frame seeming to fill the small space. The lantern cast his shadow, huge and dark, against the far wall. "Give them to me," he said, his voice rough. She hesitated for only a second before carefully, gently transferring the sleeping twins into his arms. He held them with a practiced ease, but his eyes were on her. "This arrangement is not working," he began, the words stiff. "The children, they need tending to—" He looked down at their sleeping faces, his own expression softening for a fraction of a second. "Until I can find a proper nurse. After the cattle drive, you can see to them. When needed." He met her eyes again, his own gaze hard, re-establishing the line. "The rest of your duties remain. Your room remains in the barn. Is that understood?" It was a concession wrapped in a command, an offering of trust that he tried to disguise as a simple work order. He was giving her access to the most vulnerable part of his life while trying to pretend it meant nothing. He thought of the note from the bank in his desk drawer, of Silas Crow's patient, vulture-like watch over his affairs. The drought was a weapon in Crow's hands, and Cole knew his hold on this land, on this life, was slipping. He could not afford any more weakness. Etta looked at him, her face unreadable in the flickering light. She saw the conflict in him, the pride warring with the need. She would not be a burden, and she would not be an object of pity. "I am here to work, Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice quiet but firm, rising above the renewed murmuring of the wind outside. "I do not want a debt of kindness that I cannot repay. I will earn my keep." The wind gusted, rattling the loose tin on the roof. The flame inside the lantern wavered, throwing their shadows into a chaotic, dancing frenzy. The light, like the fragile truce between them, was unsteady, uncertain, and liable to be extinguished at any moment. A new rhythm took hold at the Ashford Range, quiet and steady as a heartbeat. Etta's days began in the ink-black hours before dawn, the chill of her small room a constant summons to move. She would light a single lamp and make her way to the barn. Her first duty always to the animals, the familiar scrape of her broom on the wooden planks, the soft whisk of the currycomb through a horse's mane, the smell of fresh hay. These were the anchors of her world. They were simple, honest tasks that asked nothing of her but her effort. Her new responsibilities unfolded just as quietly. After her barn chores were done, she would cross the yard to the house, now a permissible territory. She would find Rosie already awake, a small, sleepy shadow waiting for her by the kitchen door. The little girl would wordlessly attach herself to Etta's skirt, her constant, silent companion as Etta stoked the fire in the cook stove and started breakfast. Rhett was more circumspect. He would watch her from the doorway, his gray eyes, so like his father's, filled with a solemn, childish suspicion. He held himself apart, a little soldier guarding a fortress of grief. But day by day, the distance lessened. He began to accept the spoon she offered, his small hand no longer flinching from her touch. The guarded look in his eyes slowly gave way to a quiet trust, a fragile peace that Etta nurtured with infinite patience. A week into this new arrangement, Cole announced he was riding into town for supplies. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. He looked at Etta, a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. "The children," he said, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. "They will be all right with you." "We will be fine," Etta assured him, her voice calm. Rosie squeezed her hand, a silent vote of confidence. Hours later, Cole guided his wagon down the dusty main street of Promise Creek. The town was little more than a collection of false front buildings huddled against the vast emptiness of the plains. He tied his horse in front of the general store, which shared a wall with Mabel Dunn's saloon. As he stepped onto the boardwalk, Mabel herself appeared in the saloon doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a woman built of sturdy stuff, with a tongue as sharp as barbed wire and a heart, it was rumored, as soft as fresh butter. She looked him up and down, a shrewd glint in her eye. "Ashford, you look less like a man haunted by ghosts these days." She leaned against the door frame, crossing her arms. "Heard you hired on some help." "A widow." Cole grunted, not offering any confirmation. News in this territory traveled faster than a prairie fire. Mabel's lips curved into a wry smile. "Folks are talking, saying you are a fine hand at raising cattle." "Cole, but it is the straight seam on the back of that widow's dress that is making this whole town sit up a little straighter." Cole's jaw tightened. He hated being the subject of gossip. "She sweeps the barn. Mabel, that is all." Is it Mabel's gaze was knowing? "Well, whatever she is doing, it seems to be agreeing with you. Your shoulders are not quite so close to your ears." She disappeared back into the saloon's smoky interior, leaving Cole standing in the street, feeling as though he had been seen right through. Her words were a prophecy. On Sunday, when he took the children to the small clapboard church, he felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes. Etta had remained at the ranch, claiming she had mending to do, but her presence was felt all the same. After Reverend Hale's sermon on the perils of passing judgment, Cole was cornered by two of the town's most devout gossips, their faces masks of pious concern. "Mr. Ashford," one began, her voice syrupy sweet, "it is a difficult thing, raising two little ones alone, but to have an unattached woman, a stranger, so close to them." "And to you," the other added, her eyes narrowing. "A man in your position is vulnerable. People will talk." Before Cole could form a reply that was not laced with curses, Reverend Hale was beside them. The Reverend was a gentleman, but his words carried the weight of Scripture. "Ladies," he said, his voice mild but firm, "I believe the good book advises us not to cast stones, especially when our own hands are still covered in flour from our morning's baking. Mr. Ashford's arrangements are his own." He gave Cole a small, supportive nod and steered the women away, leaving a wake of indignant silence. The whispers were a nuisance, but back at the ranch, a far more dangerous problem was brewing. The creek that wound through his property, the lifeblood of his herd, was shrinking. Every day, the flow seemed to weaken, the water turning sluggish and shallow. He sent one of the hands to ride upstream, and the man returned with grim news. A new dam, crude but effective, had been built just beyond the Ashford property line. It was not a beaver dam. It was the work of men. The land upstream was a tangled mess of claims and titles, but the most logical beneficiary of his misfortune was Silas Crow, whose own ranch bordered Cole's to the north. Silas had been buying up water rights for years, squeezing his neighbors with a financial pressure that was as relentless as the drought itself. Cole's anger was a cold, hard knot in his gut. He stood by the dying creek, watching his cattle mill about, their tongues lolling, their eyes dull with thirst. Pike Laramie rode up beside him, his expression grim. "It is Crow," Pike said, his voice a low growl. "Has to be. He wants to see you fail. Boss wants to pick up this land for pennies on the dollar." "I know who it is," Cole said through gritted teeth. "Then we do something about it," Pike urged, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard. A few men, a few sticks of dynamite. We ride up there tonight and we take back what is ours. Show him we are not to be pushed. It was the cowboy way, the law of the frontier, a direct, violent solution to a direct, violent provocation. Part of Cole, the part that was tired and angry and desperate, was tempted. But as they spoke, Etta walked toward them from the house, a bucket of water in each hand for the small vegetable garden she had insisted on trying to save. She stopped when she heard Pike's words, her expression unreadable. Cole expected her to shy away, to retreat from the harsh realities of men's business. Instead, she set the buckets down. "There is another way," she said, her voice clear and steady. Pike scoffed. "This ain't women's work, Etta." She ignored him, her eyes on Cole. "The headwaters of this creek are on tribal land, are they not? The Shoshone." Cole nodded, surprised by her knowledge. "They are, but they keep to themselves. They have no love for ranchers." "I have some experience with their people," Etta said quietly. "My late husband worked a survey crew near their territory. I learned a little of their ways, a little of their language. They respect gifts, and they respect directness. Violence will only turn them against you for good, but a negotiation, a request for a shared hardship, they might listen to that." Cole stared at her. In all his calculations, in all his angry plans, this was a path that had never even occurred to him. It was a woman's solution, words instead of force. But the logic of it was undeniable. Dynamite would bring the sheriff, and likely a bloody feud. A conversation might just bring water. "It is a fool's errand," Pike muttered, spitting on the ground. Cole did not answer him. He was looking at Etta as if seeing her for the first time. He saw not just a widow who could soothe his children, but a woman with a keen, practical mind. The next afternoon, he put her to the test. He needed to move a particularly stubborn stallion from one pasture to another. The horse, a fiery beast named Tempest, was known for his violent temper and had injured more than one ranch hand. Cole had always been the only one who could handle him. He led the horse from its stall, its eyes rolling, its muscles bunched and ready to fight. "Take him," Cole said to Etta, holding out the lead rope. Pike, who was watching from the corral fence, laughed out loud. "Boss, you want her to get herself killed." Etta looked at the massive, trembling animal, then at Cole. She saw the challenge in his eyes. Without a word, she took the rope. She did not pull or fight. Instead, she began to speak to the horse in a low, crooning voice, the same soft tone she used with the twins. She reached out a hand, not toward his head, but toward his powerful shoulder, letting him feel her touch, her scent. The horse snorted, stamping a hoof, but he did not pull away. She kept talking, her voice a gentle, continuous stream. Slowly, miraculously, the tension seemed to drain from the stallion's body. His ears, which had been pinned back in anger, flickered and relaxed. After a few minutes, she gave a gentle tug on the rope, and the great horse followed her, as meek as a lamb. She led him to the new pasture and released him without incident. As she walked back, she passed Cole, whose face was a study in astonishment. The respect in his eyes was now clear and undisguised. Pike Laramie, however, watched the exchange with a sour, curdled expression. Every small victory for Etta felt like a personal defeat for him. Her growing influence with the boss was a threat to his own position. He began a quiet campaign of his own. A newly mended harness, one Etta had worked on, was found broken. A gate was left open, allowing a few calves to wander off, taking hours to round up. Each time, Pike would shake his head and mutter, just loud enough for the other hands to hear. Things were not like this before. Too many distractions around here now. He never accused her directly, but the insinuation was a poison that slowly dripped into the bunkhouse chatter. One evening, while mending one of Rhett's shirts, Etta found herself in Cole's small, Spartan office, searching for a spare button in a tin box. Her hand brushed against a stack of papers on the corner of the desk. The top one was a formal letter from the Promise Creek Bank, signed by its president. Silas Crow. It was a mortgage agreement. Her eyes scanned the page. Her literacy. Once a simple point of pride, now a source of dread. She saw the principal amount, the punishing interest rate, and the final due date. It was less than 2 months away. If Cole could not make the payment, the Ashford Range would belong to Silas Crow. Suddenly, the thin cattle, the dying creek, and the constant worry in Cole's eyes all snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. She went to him later that night as he was cleaning a rifle on the porch. She held up the shirt. "I could not find a matching button," she said, her voice betraying none of her turmoil. Then, she took a breath. "Mr. Ashford, I know it is not my place, but my skills, I have helped deliver babies. I can set a broken bone, stitch a wound. I know which herbs can bring down a fever. These are things people will pay for. If I could earn a little extra to contribute." His head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a fierce, wounded pride. "I provide for my own," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I do not take charity, not from you, not from anyone." The rejection was absolute, a steel door slamming shut between them. He saw her offer not as a partnership, but as an indictment of his failure. She simply nodded and retreated into the house, understanding that his pride was as much a part of this harsh landscape as the wind and the dust. Later, as the children slept, she sat by the fire in the main room, working on a different task. She had found his old winter coat, the one he wore for an evening check on the herd, its sleeve torn and its lining frayed. With neat, practiced stitches, she began to repair it. Cole came in and stood by the hearth, watching her nimble fingers work the needle and thread. The silence stretched between them, no longer angry, but filled with a kind of weary resignation. Etta did not look up from her work. "It is a funny thing," she said, her voice soft as the firelight. "Men out here build their houses strong and their fences high to keep the cold out." She knotted the thread and snipped it with her teeth. "But I have come to believe that Western men are not afraid of the cold. They are afraid of warmth." She held the coat out to him. He took it, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. He felt the neat, strong line of her stitches. It was a small, simple repair, but it was the first act of uncomplicated kindness he had received in a very long time. Miles away, in the shadow of a cottonwood grove by the nearly dry creek, two men met in the deepening twilight. Silas Crow, immaculate in his town clothes, passed a small, heavy pouch to Pike Laramie. "He will not listen to reason," Silas said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "He is stubborn, and now he has that woman filling his head with foolish ideas about talking to the natives." Pike spat on the ground, his resentment a bitter taste in his mouth. "She thinks she runs the place." "Then we must remove the distraction," Silas said simply. He looked Pike in the eye, his gaze cold and direct. "I need you to do one last thing for me, Pike, something to make it clear to Ashford that he is truly alone, and that his only choice is to accept my very generous offer." 2 days later, they set out. Cole drove the buckboard wagon, its wheels grinding over the rocky, uneven ground. He had insisted on bringing it, packed with supplies that felt more like a peace offering than provisions bags of salt, flour, sugar, and a small keg of molasses. Etta sat beside him on the hard wooden seat, with the twins nestled in a makeshift bed of blankets and straw in the wagon bed behind them. The journey took them away from the familiar, sparse grasslands and into the rugged foothills that cupped the headwaters of the creek. It was a starkly beautiful country, a land of sheer rock faces and deep, shadowed canyons. A small herd of pronghorn antelope, startled by their approach, bounded away with an impossible, fluid grace, their white rumps flashing in the morning sun. Cole handled the team with a quiet, confident skill, navigating the treacherous track that was more of a suggestion than a road. He said little, his gaze constantly scanning the terrain, his mind clearly occupied with the weight of his mission. Etta respected his silence. She watched the landscape unfold, her own senses alert. This was a world that demanded attention, The silence was not empty, it was filled with the cry of a hawk circling high above and the ceaseless whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. In the afternoon, the sky, which had been a clear, brilliant blue, turned a bruised, sullen gray. The temperature dropped, and the wind picked up a new, sharper edge. Without warning, the air was filled with a sudden, furious clatter. It was not rain, it was hail, small. Hard pellets of ice began to ricochet off the wagon, stinging their exposed skin and frightening the horses. Cole reacted instantly, pulling the team toward the shallow overhang of a rock ledge. It offered scant protection, but it was better than nothing. He jumped down and fought to calm the spooked horses while Etta scrambled into the back of the wagon, pulling a heavy canvas tarp over the twins, who had begun to cry. She huddled with them under the canvas, the sound of the hail drumming just inches above their heads, a deafening, chaotic roar. It was over as quickly as it had begun. The clouds broke, and a watery afternoon sun reappeared, turning the millions of hailstones scattered across the ground into glittering diamonds. They found the Shoshone camp an hour later. It was a small, temporary settlement in a sheltered bend of the now healthy, fast-flowing creek. Smoke rose from a single cook fire, and a few women were scraping hides stretched on wooden frames. An older man, his face a testament to a life lived under the open sky, came forward to meet them. His expression was neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. Cole stopped the wagon and began to climb down, his posture stiff, ready for a confrontation. Etta placed a hand on his arm. "Let me," she said softly. He hesitated, his pride warring with his pragmatism. He looked at the Shoshone leader, then back at her. He gave a single, curt nod and remained by the wagon. Etta walked forward alone, her hands open and empty at her sides to show she was unarmed. She stopped a respectful distance from the elder and offered a greeting in his own tongue. Her accent was clumsy, the words simple, but the effort was clear. The man's stoic expression did not change, but a flicker of interest appeared in his dark eyes. She spoke of the dry land downstream, of the thirsty cattle. She did not accuse or demand. She spoke of it as a shared problem, a hardship inflicted by the sky, not by men. Then she gestured to the wagon. Cole, taking his cue, began to unload the sacks of flour and sugar, the salt and molasses, setting them on the ground. They were not a payment, Etta explained, but a gift from one neighbor to another in a difficult season. She also brought out a small tin of the herbal salve she made, a remedy for burns and cuts, and offered it to the women. The elder listened, his gaze moving from Etta to the gifts, and finally, to the twins, who were now peering over the side of the wagon box, their faces full of wide-eyed curiosity. He spoke at length in his own language. Etta listened intently, piecing together the meaning from the words she knew and the gestures he used. He spoke of his own people's needs, of the poor hunting that season, of the need to preserve what little water there was. Finally, she proposed her solution, a shared schedule. They could have the water for 2 days, and then on the third, they would open the dam for a full day to allow the water to flow down to the Ashford Range. It would not be enough to restore the creek to its full strength, but it would be enough to keep the herd alive. The elder considered her words for a long time. He looked at Cole, a man who represented all the ranchers who had taken land and broken promises. But then he looked back at Etta, a woman who had come with gifts instead of guns, with a request instead of a demand. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. The agreement was made. As they drove away, Cole was silent. He kept glancing at Etta, a new and profound respect dawning in his eyes. He had been prepared for a fight, for a tense and possibly violent encounter. He had seen the problem as a wall to be broken down. She had seen it as a door to be unlocked. He was beginning to understand that there were different kinds of strength. Her quiet resilience, her patient diplomacy, these were tools he did not possess, but he could no longer deny their power. He was seeing a woman who knew how to live in this hard country, not just exist in it. The cowboy's rigid code of self-reliance began to feel less like a virtue and more like a blindfold. They made camp that night in a small clearing sheltered by cottonwoods. The air was cold and clean after the hailstorm. After Etta had fed the children and settled them to sleep in the wagon, she found Cole struggling with the campfire coffee. He poured a cup from the blackened pot and handed it to her. She took a sip and could not suppress a small grimace. It was impossibly bitter. A slow smile touched her lips. She looked at him over the rim of the cup, her eyes twinkling in the firelight. "It is as bitter as the first look you ever gave me, Mr. Ashford." To her surprise, a low chuckle rumbled in his chest. It was the first time she had ever heard him laugh. "I reckon you have earned the right to call me Cole," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. The darkness pressed in around them, vast and absolute, making their small fire a fragile island of warmth and light. The cold deepened, and a shiver ran through Etta. Without a word, Cole took the heavy wool blanket from his own bedroll and draped it around both their shoulders. They sat side by side, not touching, but sharing the same small pocket of warmth, the rough wool a barrier and a bridge between them. The silence returned, but it was different now, comfortable and companionable. Etta noticed his hands, clenched loosely around his coffee cup. The knuckles were raw and chapped from the cold and hard work. "Your hands are cracked," she said softly. Before he could protest, she took out the small tin of salve she carried. She took one of his large, calloused hands in her own and began to gently work the soothing ointment into his skin. Her touch was light and impersonal, the gesture of a healer. Yet it was the most profound intimacy he had experienced in years. He sat perfectly still, feeling the warmth of her hands, the scent of herbs rising from the salve, his heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The boundary between them was still there, a line of propriety and grief, but it had become thin and translucent. "Why are you not afraid?" Cole asked, his voice a low murmur. "Out here, of the work, of everything." Etta finished with his hand and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She stared into the fire, the flames dancing in her eyes. "I used up all my fear a long time ago," she said. "My husband and I, we had a son, just a baby. We were at a railroad camp in the Utah Territory. The fever came through, there was no doctor, nothing to be done." Her voice was flat, scrubbed clean of emotion by time and repetition. The worst part was the sound of him crying in the night, the sound of a pain you cannot fix. After you have lived through that, a little hard work and a cold wind do not seem so bad. She had offered him a piece of her broken heart, a shard of the past that defined her. It was a gift of trust far more precious than the supplies they had brought for the Shoshone. Cole looked at her, at the quiet strength in her profile, and knew he had to offer something in return. "My wife, Eleanor," he began, the name feeling strange on his tongue after 2 years of silence. She did not make it through the birthing. There was too much blood." He stared into the darkness beyond the fire. Seeing a ghost, it was the middle of a blizzard. The ground was frozen solid. "It took me 2 days to dig her grave." He paused, the memory raw and vivid. All that time, the wind was howling, the whole world was screaming, and all I could think about was the silence in the house. A man is supposed to be strong, quiet, but sometimes silence is not strength. It is just a place to hide. They sat for a long time after that, 2 lonely people sharing the warmth of a single fire, their unspoken griefs finally given voice. Later, as Etta checked on the twins, she saw Cole standing by the wagon, looking down at them. They were sleeping peacefully, Rosie's small hand tucked under Rhett's chin. It was the same image that had stopped him in his tracks in the barn loft. But this time, he was not a stunned, resentful observer. A look of profound, aching tenderness was on his face. He saw not a breach of his rules, but the shape of a hope he had not dared to imagine. He did not turn away. It was then that he saw it, a faint, unnatural orange glow, flickering on the distant horizon. in the precise direction of the ranch. It was too bright for a lantern, too low for a rising moon. It was a hungry, angry light that pulsed against the blackness. A fire. Etta saw it at the same moment. She came to stand beside him, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with alarm. The peace of the night was shattered, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. Cole's face was a hard mask of fury and fear. He looked from the terrible glow in the sky to Etta, and then to his sleeping children. A new kind of resolve hardened his features. He was no longer just a man fighting for his land. He was fighting for something more. He reached out and gripped her arm, his voice a low, raw rasp. "We are going home." The ride back was a frantic, punishing race against the terrible glow on the horizon. Cole pushed the horses mercilessly, his face a grim, stone-like mask in the moonlight, his knuckles white on the reins. Every jolt of the wagon, every rock that threatened to splinter a wheel, was a fresh torment. Etta held the sleeping twins, her body a shield against the rough journey, her eyes fixed on the distant fire. The smell reached them first, a foul, acrid stench of burning hay and something else, something of man-made malevolence, carried on the cruel Wyoming wind. As they crested the final rise, the full horror of the scene burst upon them. It was not just a small fire. The main hay barn was a roaring inferno, a monstrous pillar of flame and black smoke that clawed at the night sky. The wind, which had been their constant, indifferent companion, was now a vicious enemy, picking up burning embers and flinging them like fiery seeds toward the house, the bunkhouse, and the smaller barn that held his precious breeding stock. The air was filled with a terrifying cacophony, the roar of the blaze, the splintering crack of massive timbers giving way, the panicked, high-pitched bellows of the cattle, and the frantic clanging of their bells. His ranch hands were scattered and silhouetted against the flames, their efforts with buckets of water looking like a child's game against a raging giant. Cole leaped from the still-moving wagon before it had even fully stopped, shouting orders that were nearly swallowed by the roar. "Get a wet line on the house roof, soak the breeding barn. Keep the embers down." Etta passed the still-sleeping twins into the arms of a stunned ranch hand's wife, who had come running from one of the outlying cottages, her face pale with terror. "Keep them safe, away from the smoke," Etta commanded, her voice steady and clear amidst the chaos, while Cole and his men fought a desperate, tuned, direct battle with the flames. Etta's gaze went to the herd. The cattle were a surging, terrified mass, their eyes wild with fear, running blindly along the fence line, trampling each other in their panic. If they broke through, they would scatter for miles across the open range, lost to predators or thirst. They were the ranch's future, and they were about to be lost. She saw the heavy canvas tarp still in the back of the wagon. An idea, born of desperation and a deep, practical knowledge of the land, took shape in her mind. She ran to the water trough, a long wooden basin used for the horses, with adrenaline lending her strength. She hauled the heavy canvas into the water, soaking it until it was dark and dripping. "You and you," she called out to two of the younger ranch hands who were standing frozen, overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. "Help me with this." They looked at her, then at the fire, then back at her, their expressions blank with confusion. "We have to fight the fire, ma'am," one of them protested. "You will lose the herd first," Etta shot back, her voice cutting through their paralysis. "Now, help me." Galvanized by her certainty, they obeyed. Together, the three of them dragged the heavy, sodden canvas toward the panicked herd. "We need to make a smoke wall," she explained, shouting to be heard over the din. "We will use it to push them, to guide them toward the ravine. It is the only place they will be safe from the fire and contained." They held the wet canvas low to the ground near a patch of burning grass. A thick, choking cloud of white smoke and steam billowed up, forming a shifting, pungent barrier. It was brutal, exhausting work. The heat was intense, and the smoke burned their lungs. But they pressed on, using the terrifying but harmless wall of smoke to slowly, carefully, begin herding the terrified animals away from the main fire and toward the dark slash of the dry ravine on the far side of the pasture. As she worked, she saw Cole in a furious face-to-face confrontation with Pike Laramie near the northern fence line. Pike was gesturing wildly toward the dark expanse of land beyond their property, his voice rising in a desperate yell. "We have to open the north gate. Boss, it is the only way to get them clear fast enough. Let them run onto Crow's land." No, Cole's reply was a roar that seemed to momentarily silence the fire itself. His face was contorted with a rage that was almost as frightening as the flames. "I will see every last one of them burn before I owe that man a single blade of grass. We hold our ground here. Laramie, here." Pike recoiled from the force of Cole's fury, his face a mixture of fear and thwarted ambition. He threw his hands up and backed away, melting back into the chaos. Suddenly, a new, more terrible fear shot through Etta. "Rosie!" In the confusion, she had lost sight of the children. She scanned the small group of women and children huddled near the well, a safe distance from the fire. She saw Rhett, still wrapped in a blanket, but Rosie was not there. Rosietta screamed, her voice raw with panic. "Where is Rosie?" The ranch hand's wife looked around, her eyes wide with horror. "She was right here, O Lord, she was right here." A thick cloud of smoke, pushed by a sudden shift in the wind, rolled toward the main house. Etta's heart seized. Without a second's hesitation, she grabbed the storm lantern she had lit for their journey, its flame still burning with a small, steady light. She ran toward the house, plunging into the acrid, blinding smoke that swirled around the porch. "Rosie," she called, her voice breaking into a fit of coughing. The smoke was a physical entity, clawing at her throat, making her eyes stream with tears. She stumbled up the porch steps, holding the lantern high. Its light was a feeble, swimming circle in the suffocating gloom, a tiny beacon of hope against a tide of blackness. She found the little girl huddled in a corner of the porch, behind a rocking chair, her small body shaking with silent sobs. Etta scooped her up, pulling off her own heavy wool coat and wrapping it around the child, trying to create a pocket of clean air for her to breathe. "It is all right. Little one, I have got you," she choked out, her lungs screaming for air. Holding Rosie tight, Etta began to hum the simple, familiar lullaby she had sung in the barn loft, the melody a fragile thread of comfort in the terrifying night. She coughed, the song catching in her throat, but she did not stop, her voice a hoarse, determined whisper against the roar of the fire. She carried Rosie back out of the smoke, following the steady, unwavering light of her own lantern. Just as she emerged, a new sound cut through the night, the rumble of wagons and the shouts of many voices. A small army had arrived from Promise Creek. In the lead wagon, handling the reins like a seasoned teamster, was Mabel Dunn, her face grimly determined in the firelight. Behind her were a dozen men and women from the town, their wagons loaded with water barrels and buckets. Even in a crisis, Mabel could not resist a sharp word. "Took you long enough to have a proper emergency." "Ashford," she yelled. "Some of us were getting bored now. Where do you want this water?" The arrival of the townspeople, of the very community that had whispered about her, turned the tide. Their combined efforts finally began to push the fire back. With a final, groaning sigh, the main roof of the barn collapsed inward, sending a volcano of sparks into the sky. But the line had held. The house was saved. The breeding barn was saved. And thanks to Etta's quick thinking, the bulk of the herd was safe, milling restlessly in the bottom of the ravine. As the first pale, gray light of dawn began to dilute the darkness, the full extent of the devastation became clear. The hay barn was a smoldering, blackened ruin, a gaping wound on the land. Cole stood surveying the damage, his face coated in soot, his body slumped with an exhaustion that went deeper than muscle and bone. The financial loss was crippling, but it was the nature of the attack that cut the deepest. This was not a random act of nature. This was personal. He walked over to one of the main support posts of the barn that was still standing, Though deeply charred, he ran a hand over its surface. His fingers came away sticky with a thick, black, resinous substance. He brought them to his nose. The pungent, unmistakable scent of pine tar cut through the stench of the smoke. It had been used as an accelerant. This fire had been deliberately set. His eyes, cold and hard as chips of granite, swept over the exhausted, soot-stained faces of the people gathered. They stopped when they found Pike Laramie. The foreman was leaning against the corral fence, trying to look casual. But he could not hide the furtive, hunted look in his eyes. He refused to meet Cole's gaze. Cole's eyes dropped lower, to Pike's boots. On the side of one, caked with dust and ash, was a distinct, dark smear of the same black resin. The world seemed to fall silent. The last crackle of the fire, the weary murmurs of the townspeople, the lowing of the cattle, it all faded away. There was only the cold, hard certainty of betrayal. He had been stabbed in the back by one of his own men, on his own land. Reverend Hale came to stand beside him, his face etched with sorrow and compassion. He followed Cole's gaze to Pike, and then to the ruined barn. He did not need to ask. "This is a wicked thing," the Reverend said, his voice low, a wickedness that cannot be allowed to stand. He placed a hand on Cole's shoulder. "Cole, this fire and the matter of the creek, they are connected. This is an attack not just on you, but on the rule of law in this valley. We must bring it before the town council. We must have a public accounting. Justice cannot be found in the barrel of a gun, but in the clear light of day, with all our neighbors as witnesses." The days that followed the fire were a grim inventory of loss and labor. A pall of smoke and suspicion hung over the Ashford Range, thicker than the morning fog. While the townspeople had shown their better nature in the heat of the crisis, the cold light of day brought the return of whispers and sidelong glances. The war for public opinion had begun, and its first shot was fired on the holiest of grounds. On Sunday, tucked into the hymnals at the church, were small, crudely printed slips of paper. They were anonymous. Of course, the work of a coward. But the message was brutally clear. At the top, in stark black letters, were the words, "Foster Fraud." The text below was a poisonous litany of insinuation, painting Etta as a conniving opportunist who had used Cole's motherless children as leverage to work her way from a charity case in the barn to a position of influence in the house. It hinted that the fire itself was a convenient tragedy, one that had only solidified her indispensable role. The flyers were a silent, vicious attack, and they worked. The women who had offered Etta water and words of comfort after the fire now drew their skirts away, their faces closed and judgmental. The men looked at Cole with a mixture of pity and contempt, as if he were a fool who had been duped by a pretty face and a hard luck story. The air in the church was thick with a sanctimonious chill. Silas Crow chose this moment to make his move. He sent a boy with a message, summoning Cole to the bank for a meeting regarding his outstanding loan. Cole went, his jaw set, knowing it was a trap. Silas did not rise from his large leather chair when Cole entered his office. He gestured to the seat opposite his polished desk, the very picture of magnanimous authority. "Cole, a terrible business. The fire, a terrible business. I trust the damage was not terminal." "We will manage," Cole said, his voice flat. Of course," Silas said, steepling his fingers. "But management requires resources. And with the hay barn gone, your position is, shall we say, precarious." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, friendly tone. "And then there is the other matter, the talk about the widow. It is an unfortunate complication for a man of your standing, a man with children." Cole said nothing, letting the silence hang in the air. "I have a proposal," Silas continued, his smile never reaching his cold eyes. "A comprehensive solution. We could merge your debt with my assets. Think of it as a partnership. I would assume a controlling interest in the ranch. Of course, to protect my investment. We would merge the land, and we could merge the families, so to speak. He let the idea settle. The talk about the widow is a question of honor. Is it not of propriety? I have a good, hard-working tenant farmer on my north quarter, a bachelor. If the woman were to be respectably married off to him, it would solve everyone's problem. Her reputation would be secured, your honor would be satisfied, and the children would be under a proper, stable roof. Everyone wins. It was a breathtakingly audacious move, an attempt to steal his land, his autonomy, and even the people in his life, all under the guise of a helpful neighbor. He was offering to solve a problem that he himself had created. Cole stood up slowly. He looked at Silas, at the smug certainty on the banker's face, and a cold, clear anger settled over him. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. I only merge what I believe in. Silas, he said, his voice quiet but carrying the unyielding finality of a closing steel door. He turned and walked out of the office without a backward glance, leaving the banker sitting alone in stunned, furious silence. The town meeting, called by Reverend Hale, was held in that same church 2 nights later. The room was packed, the air tense and heavy. It felt less like a civic gathering and more like a trial. Etta sat beside Cole in the front pew, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her back straight. She felt the weight of every hostile stare, every whispered comment, but she did not flinch. Reverend Hale opened the proceedings, calling for civility and a search for the truth. Then he called on Etta to speak. She stood, a solitary figure in her simple, mended dress. She spoke for less than a minute, her voice clear and steady, reaching every corner of the silent room. She did not speak of rumors or her own reputation. She spoke only of the facts. She described finding Rosie lost in the smoke. She recounted her plan to save the herd. She concluded by saying she had done only what anyone would have done to protect a home and its family. Then she sat down. The simplicity and dignity of her words left a profound impression. Reverend Hale spoke next, his voice filled with a quiet authority. He confirmed what she had said, describing her as a hero who had risked her own life to save a child and an entire herd of cattle. Then Mabel Dunn stood up from the back of the room. All eyes turned to her. "I do not know much about fires or cattle," Mabel said, her voice its usual sharp, no-nonsense tone, "but I know about character. When Etta Mayfield first came to this town, she was destitute, her husband was dead, and she owed me money for his burial. She could have slipped away in the night, and no one would have been the wiser, but she did not. She worked for me for 2 weeks, scrubbing my floors and washing my glasses, until every last cent was paid. A person who pays their debts when they have nothing is not a person who schemes for what is not hers." A murmur went through the crowd. This was a new piece of information, a testament to her honor that had nothing to do with Cole Ashford. The tide of opinion was beginning to turn. Then Pike Laramie was called to give his account of the fire. He swaggered to the front, trying to project an air of confidence, but a nervous tick pulsed in his jaw. "It was a tragedy," he said, shaking his head. "The hay was dry as tinder from the drought. Must have been a bolt of dry lightning. Sparked it off. I did my best to fight it, like everyone else." He was slick, his story plausible enough to give the doubters something to cling to, but as he turned to walk back to his seat, Mabel's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. "That is funny, Pike," she said, stepping into the aisle, "because the day after the fire, you brought your laundry into town, and you paid my girl to wash it. And in the pocket of your trousers, she found this." She held up a small, greasy piece of cloth. It was a cutting from a flannel shirt. She walked to the front of the church and held it under the lantern light for all to see. It was stained with a dark, sticky substance. The pungent, unmistakable smell of pine tar filled the air. "Looks to me like you got a little sloppy when you were setting that blaze," Mabel said, her eyes boring into him. Pike's face went white. He stared at the rag as if it were a rattlesnake. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The physical evidence, undeniable and damning, hung in the air between them. The whispers in the room died, replaced by a collective, stunned silence. The community, which had been so ready to believe a lie, was now confronted with a hard, ugly truth. Some of the women who had snubbed Etta now looked at her with a dawning sense of shame. The noise of rumor had been silenced by the quiet authority of a fact. Cole felt a grim satisfaction, but it was overshadowed by a pressing, practical problem. He wanted to fire Pike on the spot, to throw him off his land and never see his treacherous face again. But the fall cattle drive was less than a week away. It was his one chance to get his herd to the railhead at Cheyenne and bring in the cash he needed to save the ranch. He was already short-handed. He could not afford to lose another man, not even a traitor. He was trapped. That night, as he paced the porch, wrestling with his impossible choice, Etta came out to join him. She stood beside him, watching the stars, which seemed cold and impossibly distant. "You cannot send him away," she said quietly, reading his thoughts. "Not yet." "I cannot trust him at my back," Cole countered, his voice a low growl. "You do not have to," she replied. "But you need the body. You need the hands. The other men can watch him." Then she offered him a lifeline, a way out of the trap he had not seen. "You are short-handed because you only think of hiring men. But this is not just men's work. A cattle drive needs cooks. It needs people to mend clothes and tend to injuries. The women in this town, the ones who helped fight the fire, they are strong, they are capable. Hire them for the support work. Let them earn a wage. It will free up your men for the herd, and it will build you allies where you now have whispers." He stopped pacing and looked at her. Her idea was radical, a departure from the way things had always been done, but it was also brilliant. It solved his labor problem, and it turned his greatest social liability, the gossiping women of the town, into a vested part of his success. He looked at her, at the intelligence and resilience shining in her eyes, and he felt a profound shift inside him. He felt as if he had been stumbling through a desert, and she had just shown him the way to an oasis. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. He reached out and gently touched her arm. "You did not just sweep the barn, Etta," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "You swept this whole house clean." The moment of warmth between them was a fragile, beautiful thing in the cold night air. But miles away, another man stood in the darkness, looking out over the valley toward the single, distant light of the Ashford Ranch. Silas Crow had lost the public battle. His pawn, Pike, had been exposed. His attempt to manipulate Cole had failed, but he was not a man who gave up. He was a man who changed tactics. He had tried to break the man, and he had failed. He had tried to discredit the woman, and he had failed. A cold, cruel smile twisted his lips in the darkness. There was still another way. If he could not get the ranch through the adults, he would get it through the children. The day after the town meeting, the sky broke. For the first time in months, a slow, steady rain began to fall, washing the layers of dust from the world and turning the parched ground to a dark, thirsty mud. It was a cleansing rain, a promise of renewal that whispered of life returning to the valley. Inside the Ashford house, the mood was one of weary, fragile peace. The rain drummed a soft, hypnotic rhythm on the roof. But in the kitchen, another, less welcome rhythm had started, the steady drip, drip, drip of water from a leak in the ceiling. Cole was on a stepladder, trying to find the source of the leak, his frustration mounting with every drop that splattered onto the floor. Etta sat by the warm cook stove with the children, a towel in her lap, patiently drying their damp hair. Rosie was humming to herself, while Rhett, for the first time, leaned his head against Etta's arm, a small, trusting weight that spoke volumes. The kitchen was an island of warmth and domestic chaos, the air filled with the scent of damp wool, wood smoke, and the rich aroma of coffee. Cole came down from the ladder, muttering a curse. He had scraped his wrist on a splintered roof beam during the fire, a minor injury he had ignored. But the dampness had now irritated the burn, turning it an angry red. He grimaced as he absent-mindedly rubbed at it. "Let me see that," Etta said, her voice soft. "It is nothing." "A nothing can turn into a something if it is not cared for," she countered, her tone leaving no room for argument. She took him by the arm and led him to a chair by the firelight. The children watched, their faces solemn. Etta brought her small tin of salve and a clean cloth. She knelt before him, taking his large, calloused hand in hers. The world seemed to shrink to the small space between them. The rain, the dripping leak, the crackle of the fire had all faded into a low hum. All Cole was aware of was her touch, gentle and sure, as she cleaned the angry scrape. Her head was bent in concentration, and a stray lock of damp hair fell across her cheek. He could feel the warmth of her breath on his skin, could count the steady, quiet rhythm of her breathing. It was an intimacy more profound than a shout, a silent language of care and trust that he had forgotten how to speak. A current, subtle but powerful, passed between them, a recognition of something that had been growing in the spaces between their shared hardships. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet room. "I have a fear of needles," he admitted, his voice low, "and of doctors." Etta looked up, a small, wry smile touching her lips. The firelight danced in her eyes. "That is good," she said, her voice a teasing whisper. "Because I am cheaper, and I cause much less pain." Her smile reached him, breaking through the layers of his weariness and grief. He felt a genuine smile return, a feeling so unfamiliar it was almost a shock. In that moment, watching her tend to his minor wound with such focused gentleness, he felt a sense of rightness, a feeling of coming home to a place he did not know he had been searching for. The sound came from outside, faint at first, then more distinct over the drumming of the rain, the slow, deliberate tread of horses, more than one, circling the yard. It was not the sound of a neighborly visit. It was the sound of a stealthy, unwelcome presence. Instantly, the fragile peace of the room was shattered. Cole was on his feet, his hand instinctively going to the hunting rifle he kept mounted over the fireplace. He moved to the window, peering out into the gray, rainy twilight, but saw nothing. The sound faded. It was a warning, a deliberate act of intimidation. "Stay here," he said to Etta, his voice a low command. He moved through the house, his steps quiet and purposeful. He barred the front door, a heavy wooden beam that had not been used in years. He went to the back door and slid the bolt home. He moved from window to window, checking the latches, securing their small island of warmth against the encroaching threat. The danger outside only seemed to amplify the preciousness of what was inside. The warm kitchen, the two small children, the quiet woman by the fire. This was his world, and he would defend it with his life. He came back to the kitchen to find Etta standing where he had left her, her face pale, but her eyes steady. The air between them was charged with all the things that had not been said, with the shared danger and the unspoken bond that had been forged in fire and fear. He walked toward her until he was standing directly in front of her. He did not touch her, not yet. He simply looked at her, his gray eyes filled with an emotion she had never seen there before, a raw, vulnerable sincerity. He gently reached up and touched her forehead with his fingertips, a gesture of profound respect, asking a question without words. Etta's breath caught in her throat. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of hungry passion, but of deep, reverent tenderness. It was short, a mere breath of a touch, but it held the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and wood smoke, and the promise of a future. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. "When the rainy season is over," he said, his voice a rough whisper, "when the grass is green again, and we have brought the herd back from Cheyenne, if you still want to, we will call this place home." It was a promise, But it was also a choice. Her choice. Etta felt tears well in her eyes. Tears not of sorrow, but of a hope so fierce it was painful. She could only nod again, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. A small tug on her skirt broke the spell. She looked down to see Rosie looking up at her, the little girl's face full of a child's simple, profound logic. "Mama Etta," she asked, her voice a small, hopeful question. The word struck Etta with the force of a physical blow. It was the name of a ghost, a title she thought she had buried forever. A wave of love and loss and fear washed over her. She could not accept the name, but she could not deny it either. She simply knelt and gathered the little girl into her arms, holding her tight, burying her face in Rosie's still damp hair. The seed of a new family, planted in the harshest of soils, was beginning to sprout. Later, after the children were asleep, Etta stood in the kitchen, her hand resting on the warm metal of the lantern that hung from a beam overhead. Its flame burned with a bright, unwavering light, a steady presence in the heart of the house. It was a symbol of how far they had come, from a flickering, uncertain hope to a solid, dependable warmth. Cole came to her and pressed something cool and heavy into her hand. It was a large, old-fashioned iron key. "It is for the grain store," he said simply. "You should have it." It was more than a key. It was a transfer of trust, a symbol of partnership. He was giving her a share of his responsibility, a tangible piece of his life. Just as her fingers closed around it, a sharp, urgent knock rattled the back door, making them both jump. It was a heavy, insistent sound that did not belong to a friend. Cole motioned for her to stay back, his face instantly reverting to a hard, protective mask. He picked up the rifle again and moved to the door. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice sharp. "It is Pike," a voice answered from the other side, strained and breathless. "You have to come quick." "Boss, it is the herd. Something has spooked them. They are breaking out of the ravine." Cole hesitated, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. He glanced out the small window beside the door. In the deepening gloom, he could see Pike's silhouette on the porch, his shoulders hunched against the rain. But something was wrong. The foreman's eyes, visible for a second in a flash of distant lightning, held a strange, wild, and fearful look. And beyond him, just at the edge of the light spilling from the window, Cole thought he saw another shadow, a second figure, standing half-hidden by the corner of the fence line, a silent, menacing presence, waiting in the rain. Cole's denial was instant and instinctive. Pike's story made no sense. The herd was secure in the ravine, too tired and weak to stampede. This was a lie, a trick. The shadow he had seen, the second man, confirmed it. This was not about cattle. This was a trap. While Cole's mind raced, calculating the threat, Etta's moved on a different, more primal frequency. It was not a sound that alerted her, but the sudden absence of one. The house, which moments before had held the soft, sleeping breaths of her two charges, was now utterly silent. A cold dread, sharper and more terrifying than any physical threat, pierced her heart. "The children," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. She turned from the tense standoff at the door and ran up the narrow staircase. The room was empty. The small beds were empty, the blankets thrown back. A cold, rainy draft blew in from a window that had been pushed open. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She ran back down, her feet barely touching the stairs. As she burst back into the kitchen, she heard it, a faint, unfamiliar sound from outside, almost lost in the steady drumming of the rain. It was a thin, tinny note, like a cheap toy horn. It was a sound designed to entice a child. Cole saw the look on her face and knew, even before she spoke, that the true nature of the attack had been revealed. The story about the herd was a diversion, a way to draw him out, to separate him from the one thing he valued more than his land, more than his own life. Etta ran out into the mud and the rain. her eyes scanning the dark, sodden yard. The rain plastered her hair to her face, but she did not feel it. Her entire being was focused on a single point of terrible clarity. And then she saw it. Snagged on the rough iron hinge of the north pasture gate was a small scrap of red wool. Rosie's scarf, the one Etta had knitted for her just last week. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Pike, seeing the discovery, seeing the game was up, made a desperate move, shoving past Cole and running for his horse. But Cole was faster. He caught the foreman in 2 long strides, spinning him around and slamming him against the side of the house. "Where are they?" Cole roared, his voice a terrifying sound of pure, unrestrained fury. Pike's face crumpled in fear and guilt. "He made me do it. Boss Crow, he has them. He took them up the canyon. He just wanted to talk to you." That is all he said. But they were already moving. Cole did not waste a precious second on the traitor. He ran for the stable, Etta right behind him. They saddled 2 horses in a blur of frantic, desperate energy, their hands working with a single, shared purpose. There were no words. There was only the driving, sickening need to get their children back. They rode out, leaving Pike standing alone in the rain. They followed the fresh tracks of a 3rd horse, its hoofprints deeper than the others, showing it was carrying a heavier load. The trail led away from the ranch and toward the narrow, winding mouth of the canyon that snaked its way into the foothills. The rain, which had been a steady, cleansing force, now became a malevolent enemy. It fell in hard, driving sheets, turning the ground to slick, treacherous mud and blurring their vision. The rock walls of the canyon closed in around them, amplifying the sound of the wind and the rushing water in the creek bed beside them. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every bend in the path a potential ambush. They rounded a sharp curve in the trail and were forced to pull their horses to a halt. There, in a small, slightly wider part of the canyon, was Silas Crow. He was mounted on his fine black gelding, sitting tall and immaculate even in the downpour. Beside him, tethered to his saddle horn, was a 2nd horse. Rosie and Rhett were in the saddle, tied together, their small faces pale and streaked with rain, their eyes wide with terror. Pike stood near them on foot, looking like a man who had lost his soul, his head bowed against the rain. "Ashford," Silas called out, his voice calm and controlled, cutting through the sound of the storm. "I am glad you could join us. I believe we have some business to conclude." Cole swung down from his horse, his body coiled with a violence he was barely holding in check. "Let the children go! Crow!" "All in good time," Silas said smoothly. He patted a leather satchel that was tied to his saddle. "First, a simple transaction. Inside this bag is the deed to your ranch, along with a bill of sale. You will sign it, transferring all rights and titles to me. In exchange, I will give you back what is yours." He smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his face. "It is a fair trade. I think, your land for your legacy." It was the ultimate checkmate. He had found Cole's one true weakness, the one thing he would trade everything for. But before Cole could respond, another voice, deeper and more menacing than any man's, answered. It was a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. The ground beneath their feet trembled. The steady roar of the creek beside them swelled into a deafening, terrifying crescendo. Etta looked upstream, her eyes widened in horror. It was not just a swollen creek anymore. A churning, muddy wall of water, thick with uprooted trees and debris, was thundering down the narrow canyon toward them. A flash flood. The horses screamed in terror. Silas's gelding reared, its eyes rolling wildly. The horse carrying the children stumbled on the slick, muddy bank, its legs buckling. The force of the movement snapped the crude ropes holding the twins, and they were thrown from the saddle. They landed not in the water, but on a large, flat-topped boulder that had, until moments ago, been part of the creek bank. Now, it was an island, with the raging, rising water swirling on all sides. The world dissolved into chaos. Cole fought to control his terrified horse. Pike stood frozen, his face a mask of abject horror. Silas, his face contorted in a snarl of frustration, tried to steer his mount toward higher ground. Etta did not hesitate. Her mind, honed by a life of survival, saw only the problem and the solution. She saw the children, crying and clinging to the slippery rock. She saw the torrent of water rising around them. And she saw, on the bank near her, a young cottonwood tree, its trunk no thicker than her arm, but its roots dug deep into the earth. She slid from her horse, grabbing the coil of rope that hung from Cole's saddle. Her hands, no longer trembling, worked with a swift, sure competence. She looped one end of the rope around the base of the cottonwood, securing it with a knot that would not slip. She tied the other end tightly around her own waist. Then, without a backward glance, she stepped into the churning, muddy water. The current was a physical blow, a monstrous, unseen hand that tried to tear her from her feet. The icy water clawed at her legs, pulling and sucking at her, but she leaned into it, her eyes fixed on the children. She fought for every step, her hands gripping the rope, the lifeline, as she moved slowly, painstakingly, across the raging current. On the bank, a different kind of drama was unfolding. In his struggle to control his horse, Silas's precious leather satchel had come loose and fallen into the water. It began to float away, bobbing in the current. At the same time, a massive, uprooted log was tumbling down the floodwater, directly on a collision course with the boulder where the children were stranded. Silas saw both threats. He saw the imminent danger to the children, and he saw his prize, the deed to the ranch, floating away in a single damning moment of choice. He ignored the children and lunged for the satchel. Pike saw it. He saw everything. He saw the cold, calculating greed in Silas's eyes. He saw the man he had sold his soul to value a piece of paper over the lives of two innocent children. Something inside him, a long-buried piece of his conscience, roared to life. He looked at the rope tethering Silas's horse to a nearby bush, the only thing keeping the panicked animal from bolting. With a guttural cry that was part rage and part a desperate plea for redemption, Pike pulled out his bowie knife and, with a one vicious slash, cut the rope. Freed! Silas's horse gave a terrified scream and plunged into the current, scrambling for purchase and heading downstream. Silas, his hand just inches from his satchel, was ripped from the saddle and thrown headlong into the torrent. Etta reached the boulder. She wrapped her arms around the two small, trembling bodies, shielding them with her own, her voice a constant, reassuring murmur against the roar of the water. Cole, seeing that the children were safe for the moment, spurred his horse into the flood after Silas. The fight was a brutal, swirling melee in the raging water. Cole's rifle was long gone, useless. This was a battle of fists and will, a primal struggle for justice. It was at that moment that the riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon. It was Mabel Dunn, Reverend Hale, and half a dozen men from the town. Drawn by Pike's wild ride and the sense that something was terribly wrong at the Ashford Range, they arrived to a scene of biblical fury. They saw it all, the heroic woman clinging to two small children on a rock in the middle of a flood, their rancher locked in a life-or-death battle with the town banker, and the foreman, Pike Laramie, standing on the bank like a man who had just witnessed his own damnation and rebirth. They reacted instantly, their petty squabbles and gossip washed away by the raw, undeniable truth of the moment. They threw ropes, pulling a sputtering, defeated Silas from the water. They helped Cole find his footing, and they formed a human chain, reaching out into the water to help Etta bring the children safely back to the shore. The climax ended not with a gunshot, but with a moment of profound, aching silence. Etta, shivering and exhausted, placed Rosie and Rhett into Cole's waiting arms. He pulled all three of them into a fierce, crushing embrace, a solid, unbreakable unit forged in the heart of the storm. He held them, his family, as the rain began to soften around them. his face buried in Etta's wet hair. Silas was hauled to his feet, a pathetic, mud-caked figure, his power and arrogance washed away by the flood. He was alive, but his life as a man of influence was over. Reverend Hale looked at the scene, at the exhausted family, at the disgraced banker, at the redeemed foreman, and at the muddy, churning water that was already beginning to recede. "There are floods that come to wash the dirt from the land," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, weary wisdom. "And there are floods that come to wash it from a man's soul." The flood waters receded as quickly as they had come, leaving behind a world scoured clean and irrevocably changed. The trial, if it could be called that, was held not in a formal courthouse, but in the same church where the community's judgment had first been wielded so cruelly against Etta. This time, however, the atmosphere was not one of pious suspicion, but of a solemn, sober search for truth. The entire town was present, their faces etched with the gravity of what they had witnessed. The evidence was laid out on a simple wooden table before Reverend Hale, who presided over the hearing with the authority of a man who had seen both the best and worst of his flock. There was the greasy, tar-stained rag that Mabel Dunn had produced, a silent, damning witness. There was the testimony of the men who had seen the pine tar on the charred timbers of the barn. And then there was the testimony of Pike Laramie. He stood before the assembly, no longer the swaggering foreman, but a man stripped bare of all pretense. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at Cole, and then at Etta. He spoke in a low, halting voice, confessing not everything, but enough. He admitted to setting the fire, claiming Silas Crow had paid him, preying on his jealousy and greed. He spoke of the plan to block the creek. He painted himself as a weak man who had made a terrible mistake, and he asked not for forgiveness, but for a chance to leave the territory with what little dignity he had left. His confession, though self-serving, was the final nail in Silas Crow's coffin. When it was Silas's turn to speak, he was a shadow of his former self. His fine clothes were stained with mud, his face was bruised from the fight with Cole, and his arrogance had been replaced by a sullen, venomous silence. He denied everything, of course, but his words were empty, hollowed out by the weight of the evidence and the testimony of a dozen people who had seen him value a leather bag over the lives of 2 children. The verdict, when it came, felt less like a sentence and more like the formal recognition of a truth that everyone in the room now knew. Silas Crow was found guilty of willful destruction of property, of coercion, and of endangering the lives of minors. He was to be held for the territorial marshal, who would see him transported to the federal prison. His power in the valley was broken, shattered as completely as a dam in a flash flood. In a final act of communal justice, the town council, with Reverend Hale's guidance, declared the water rights along the contested stretch of the creek to be held in common trust until the territorial government could make a final ruling. The schedule for sharing the water would be the one Etta Mayfield had negotiated with the Shoshone. The day after the hearing, as Pike Laramie was packing his meager belongings onto a borrowed mule, Cole and Etta approached him. He did not meet their eyes, his shame a palpable thing between them. "I wrote it all down," he said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "Everything Crow did, signed it. It is for the marshal." He held it out to Cole. Cole took the paper. He looked at the man who had betrayed him, a man he had once trusted. He saw not a monster, but a man broken by his own weakness. "Where will you go?" Cole asked, his voice devoid of anger. "West," Pike mumbled. "California, maybe. Someplace where nobody knows my name." He finally looked up, his eyes meeting Cole's. He extended his hand. "I am sorry, boss, for everything." Cole hesitated for a moment, then took the offered hand. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, but of closure, a recognition that the debt of violence and betrayal had been paid in full. Pike then turned to Etta. He did not offer his hand. He simply bowed his head, a gesture of profound, silent respect for the woman whose strength he had so badly underestimated. Then he turned and led his mule away, a lonely figure walking toward a new, uncertain horizon. The social healing began in small, quiet ways. The same women who had slipped the poisonous flyers into the church hymnals now came to the ranch, their hands filled with offerings of freshly baked bread and jars of preserves. They came to Etta, their eyes downcast, and offered stammering, heartfelt apologies. Etta accepted them with a simple, quiet grace that shamed them more than any angry words could have. Mabel Dunn, watching one of these awkward encounters from the porch, snorted with a kind of grim satisfaction. She clapped Etta on the shoulder. "Do not you mind them, girl," she said. "Rumors are like dust. A good long rain settles them all." The rain had settled more than just the dust. The parched land drank deeply, and a faint, hopeful blush of green began to appear on the hillsides. With the water flowing freely from the headwaters, the cattle began to regain their strength. When Cole and his newly organized crew, which included 3 capable townswomen hired on as cooks and support staff, drove the herd to Cheyenne, they found the prices high. The sale brought in more than enough to satisfy the renegotiated loan from the bank, whose terms were now overseen by a committee of concerned citizens, ensuring a fair interest rate. The Ashford Range was saved. A deep and profound peace settled over the house. The nights were quiet, filled only with the gentle sounds of the wind and the rain. One evening, Etta sat in the rocking chair by the fire, watching the twins sleep. They were curled together on a pallet of blankets on the hearth, their small faces peaceful and untroubled in the warm, flickering light. Rosie's arm was thrown over Rhett, her natural, protective instinct already showing itself. Etta felt a wave of love for them so powerful it was a physical ache in her chest. She remembered the nights of terror, the sound of their crying that had mirrored the crying in her own soul. Now, their quiet, even breathing was the most beautiful sound in the world. She was not startled by a sudden noise, did not jump at a shadow. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long had finally, completely dissolved. Cole came and stood behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders. He followed her gaze to the sleeping children. "They have not had a nightmare since the flood," he said softly. "Neither have I," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. Later that week, Cole took her by the hand and led her to the front door of the house. He stopped on the threshold, the place that had once been the invisible line she was forbidden to cross, the rule that had defined the beginning of their story, the harsh, protective boundary he had drawn around his life. Barn only. He looked down at her, his gray eyes soft and full of a quiet, certain light. "The barn is for the horses." "Etta," he said, his voice low and steady, "your place is here." He gently pulled her forward, across the threshold and into the heart of the house. It was a simple act, a single step, but it changed everything. It was a formal, public declaration that she was no longer an employee, no longer an outsider. She was home. The symbols of their new life began to replace the old. One afternoon, Cole sat on the porch, carefully fitting a new piece of clean, clear glass into the frame of the storm lantern that had been her beacon in the smoke. The light, he knew, would burn even brighter now. Etta sat beside him, her hands busy with a different task. She was braiding the old, stiff length of rope that had once hung by the barn door, the rope that had once symbolized the duties and bindings of a hard, lonely life. With patient, skillful fingers, she wove it into a sturdy, circular frame, a perfect, unbroken ring. It was for a photograph, she said, a new one, of the 4 of them, to hang over the mantelpiece. An old burden had become the frame for a new family. That evening, as they stood on the porch, watching the last of the rain clouds break apart to reveal a sky full of stars, Cole took her hand. The air was clean and cold, smelling of wet earth and new beginnings. "I made you a promise," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I said that when the rainy season was over, we would call this place home." He turned to face her, his hands enclosing hers. "The rain is over. Etta." He looked into her eyes, his own filled with a love that was as solid and real as the land beneath their feet. "I was wrong. I do not want to wait." He took a deep breath, the words coming from the very center of his being. "Right now, Etta. Let us call it home right now." The preparations for the wedding were as simple and as real as the love they shared. There would be no fancy dress, no elaborate ceremony. Etta gathered wildflowers from the newly green meadows. She fashioned ribbons from the colored string on the flour sacks. And for a ring, Cole took a single, old horseshoe nail, heated it in the forge until it glowed with a fiery orange light, and hammered it on the anvil, shaping it, smoothing it, and polishing it until it shone with a soft, dull luster. A perfect, unbreakable circle of humble, hard-won love. They were married on a Sunday, in the golden light of a late afternoon, beneath the sprawling branches of the great cottonwood tree that stood sentinel by the creek. It was the same tree that had served as Etta's anchor in the flood, its deep roots a testament to endurance, its new leaves a promise of life's stubborn, beautiful persistence. The entire town of Promise Creek was there, not as an assembly of judges, but as a gathering of witnesses who had seen the worst of themselves and had chosen to be better. Their presence was a quiet, collective apology and a heartfelt endorsement, a final, public mending of the social fabric that had been so badly torn. An old ranch hand with a weathered fiddle played a slow, sweet melody that drifted on the breeze, a tune that spoke of lonely campfires and hard-won joy. Reverend Hale stood before them, his face filled with a gentle, paternal warmth. Cole stood tall and straight, his usual stoicism softened by an undeniable light in his eyes. He wore his best coat, the one Etta had mended, the neat line of her stitches a private, visible mark of her care. Etta wore a simple dress of borrowed blue calico, her hair adorned with the wildflowers she had gathered herself. She held not a fancy bouquet, but the small hands of Rosie and Rhett, who stood on either side of her, their faces scrubbed clean and shining with a solemn importance. When it came time for the vows, there were no grand pronouncements or memorized verses. There was only the simple, unvarnished truth, spoken from the heart. Cole turned to Etta, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Etta," he began, his gaze holding hers, "you came to this place asking only to sweep a barn, but you swept out the silence and the sorrow. You swept the fear out of me." He paused, his throat tight. "You taught me that a home is not just a house, but a place where a heart can be safe." Tears welled in Etta's eyes, but her voice was clear when she answered, a quiet, steady current in the afternoon stillness. "Cole," she said, her hand tightening on his, "I came here with nothing, looking only for a place to hide. But you saw me. You called me home before I even dared to believe I had one." Then it was time for the ring. Rosie and Rhett, their movements full of a self-conscious gravity, walked forward together. They held between them a small, polished wooden box, with trembling fingers. Rhett opened the lid, and Rosie carefully lifted out the single, humble ring made from a horseshoe nail. It shone in the sunlight, a perfect, unbroken circle forged in the fire of their own hearth, with a hand that was not quite steady. Cole took the ring and slid it onto Etta's finger. It was a perfect fit. But the ceremony was not over. Cole turned to the small table beside Reverend Hale, where a single document and a bottle of ink lay waiting. It was a new deed for the Ashford Range. He picked up the pen and, in front of the entire town, signed his name. Then he handed the pen to Etta. Her hand trembled as she wrote her own name beside his Etta Mayfield Ashford. In that single, public act, the personal and the communal became one. The justice of the heart was now bound by the law of the land, witnessed and affirmed by the community that they would help to lead. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the valley, the small gathering became a quiet celebration, The air was filled with the smell of wet earth and the sound of laughter. The wind, once a harbinger of hardship, now whispered through the eaves of the house like a soft, melodic flute. It was a landscape transformed, a world made new. Later, long after the last of the guests had departed, after the children were tucked safely into their beds, Cole and Etta stood alone in the kitchen. The only light came from the warm, flickering glow of the fire in the hearth. The house was quiet, wrapped in a blanket of profound and peaceful silence. He had built this house with his own hands, a fortress against the world, but it had never felt truly whole, truly warm, until now. He led her to the fire, and they stood for a long time, simply watching the flames dance. They were two solitary souls who had been forged into a single unit by the harsh pressures of the frontier. They had faced down drought and fire, flood and betrayal, and had emerged not just intact, but stronger, family. They had both learned was not just a matter of blood, but a choice you made every single day. And justice was not something handed down from on high, but something you built together, with your own two hands, with courage and with kindness. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. In the soft firelight, their shadows stretched and merged on the wall behind them, two distinct shapes becoming one, a silent, graceful dance of union. It was a quiet, private consummation, an intimacy of the soul that was more profound than any spoken word. On the wall above the mantelpiece, the newly framed photograph now hung. The braided rope, once a symbol of duty and hardship, now formed a circle of protection around the four smiling faces captured in the image. And on the windowsill, where it had been placed to catch the first light of morning, the old storm lantern stood. Its new glass was clean and bright, and the flame within burned with a steady, unwavering light, casting a gentle, protective glow upon the family. In the seasons to come, there would be new calves in the spring pastures. The small room off the kitchen would become an infirmary, where Etta would use her skills to tend to the needs of her neighbors. The Ashford Range would be more than just a ranch. It would be an anchor, a place of sanctuary and strength for the whole community. But tonight, it was simply a home. In the land of the cutting wind, the heart still finds its way home when someone is willing to light a lamp. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can reach more listeners like you.